Hello and welcome to Let's Have a Chat About Murder. As you can see, this is a new sort of podcast that I'm doing as an extra really to the ones that I put up on a Wednesday and Friday. Now, this case, I have to say, is one of the reasons why I've done it, because I've done John Wayne Gacy, as many of you have listened to and also seen on Murder Analysed. But when I was writing the Gacy case, I mean, you're talking about 40, 50 pages, and I had to limit it really to that, the information that was around. So when I decided to do Gacy as a case, I only really looked at why maybe he had done it, his, how much sort of you could put into one video, which was over an hour long. If I'd done this whole case on Gacy, I think it would have been 4 hours long, which is terrible for uploads, to tell you the truth. As many of you know, when you're uploading footage in video, it can take hours to upload anyway. And I wanted to bring more to Let's Have a Chat About Murder, because that's really what it is, isn't it? We're talking about different murderers and stuff like that. And I felt that the way to do that was to add parts to it. So with this case, when we're talking about John Wayne Gacy, the second part, the bits that I couldn't really fit in, and to tell you the truth, I can't fit everything in even to this. It would take ages. So I wanted to make sure that I got the extra bits in about the unknown victims, about this paedophile ring that he was linked to, how he was inspired by the Candyman and stuff like that, this Dean Coral. Now, there's so much about Gacy that's still unknown. Really, when they executed him in the 90s, there was so much more, and he was trying to say there was other people involved in these murders. He was trying to say that. And you could say, was he passing the buck? It could have been. I mean, the thing is with serial killers, they're usually bloody liars as well when you think about it. They're never truthful. But I do believe that there is more victims of Gacy. I do believe he was linked to the paedophile ring. That is clear, actually, I think, by what's been written so far about him. And as people still investigate, I mean, the Gacy case is still really ongoing, really, for many, many reasons. Also, some of the people that work for him were also linked to other people. And, so there's lots about Gacy that's still not there. So this is all theories, I think, based on sort of evidence, circumstantial evidence, should I say. But there is clear links, I think, if you want to put it that way. So it's really important that when we look at these cases, that we look at them in the full length, in their entirety, because to give you some, indication of just how bad these people are. And especially the people that he was linked to. Now, the other person that we're going to mention in this case is John David Norman. Now, that's a case in itself, really, but we will be briefly bringing him into it, because really he was the paedophile of all paedophiles, and he did run this, sex ring right across America, into Europe and Canada. This is this really serious man, and there is links between him. There is links between Gacy, him, and one of Gacy's employees, which was this man's right-hand man, really. And so when Gacy tries to tell you about there were other people involved in this case, this Philip Pasks, he was involved, or allegedly involved, but he certainly was involved with John David Norman. So this case is complicated, I suppose, when we look at, what's going on in the 70s in America. There was so much going on. And to tell you the truth, it still goes on today. It's just, beneath the surface now. It's more on the dark web, where before they didn't have that. And so it was put in newspaper ads and different stuff like that, which attracted paedophiles to this sort of organisation, should you say. Because I think when we look at the victims, there were so many from all these victims, same ages, same sort of victims, when we look at the victimology of it. they're all very similar, and they're all linked. I think just even through that, they're linked. So listen, I hope you enjoy it. This is the first separate podcast that will not be on Murder Analysed or any other channels that I run. This is specifically for you. So grab yourself a coffee and let's have a chat about murder. So let's start. So I suppose it has been decades, hasn't it, really, since, this needle containing this lethal injection, this cocktail of chemicals that was put into this chubby arm of this John Wayne Gacy, this clown killer. And, to tell you the truth, it needed to be. He needed to have that done. I think in the end he wanted it done. But as I said, before he was, the time was coming, he was trying to say, hang on a minute, there is more. There is a lot more to this than what you know. And there's a lot of detectives still out there, that are looking into this case even today. So this, Chicago-born mass murderer responsible for sexual torture and murder of 33 young men and boys was dead, and that was it. People think that's it, it's over. That was all there was. And I think Gacy, terrorised, didn't he, Chicago really until 1978. And I think when we look at his victims, the ones that were found under his crawl space in his home, and then the ones he dumped in the river, there is really a retired detective out there, and it's Rafael Tovar, and he was convinced that there was more victims, and he also said that Gacy had actually told him there was more victims out there. And he even says, can you honestly believe that this man had this gap of a few years, because there was a few years when he was not active. It's very unusual for a serial killer like him in that time to have 3 or 4 years gap. They're usually doing something. So what this detective was trying to say is, well, maybe the crawl space under the house was only one part of, where he used to dump his bodies. Where did he dump them before that? Where were these bodies? It's very unusual that this killers like this really stop killing. So he says it really sounds like there's more, about 45 sounds a good number, and I think Gacy said that as well, but he really couldn't remember because he just killed so many. So I think in the 1970s he went around, this Gacy, didn't he? And he hunted for these young men. They were hitchhikers, they were picked up from bus stops, they were picked up really from the street. And I think, as he says, the first murder, he stabbed Timothy Jack McCoy to death after picking him up from this Greyhound bus station. Now this is where he picked up a lot of these kids, to tell you the truth. He did. But from 1972 to 1975, there were no records of Gacy's murders. Now this is a period of time where they feel that there was more bodies, and that his methodology really of hunting and disposing of these bodies had changed, or was the first before he went under his house and buried, the floorboards, and buried these kids. So I suppose the question is, from 1972 to 1975, either he didn't kill, or he must have improved his dump sites, right? So what is it? I don't think someone like Gacy, the killer he was, didn't kill between 1972 and 1975. I actually believe this detective and thinking, there was many, many more, probably more than 45, and he'd used other dump sites, or he'd been mixed in with this Norman man, where they were killing kids in different areas and using different dump sites, or they were selling these kids on to be trafficked and then to be murdered. So if that's the case, all his crimes may not have been committed in Chicago area. They would have been in lots of different areas around America, and this is in different states. And I think this is interesting fact, really, when you think about it, where this detective believes, and also that this is what Gacy was trying to say. I think what they've said, he was inspired by the Candyman. Now, Dean Arnold Carell, now he was born December 24th, 1939, and he died on 8th of August 1973, and he was actually killed by some victims and also killed by some accomplices he was with. You know, he was an American serial killer and who abducted, raped and murdered a minimum of about 28 young boys and men between 1970 and 1973. And they're saying that Gacy, this was sort of his hero. He really thought this man was great because his kills were very, very the same, actually nearly exactly the same as the Candyman, or we call him the Candyman, this Dean. Now, he also had accomplices. He had young boys that he had met and groomed and stuff and brought them in and really to help him kill. And again, he picked his victims up from different areas, bus stations, this, that and the other. Now, his crimes became known as he was a Houston mass murderer. Came to light after, really, he was shot. So, he was getting away with murder for many, many years. Now, these are only the crimes they know about. These are where this accomplice has told what was going on. But whether he killed before this is unknown. But he killed 28 teenage boys, but very, very similar, not even, you could say, exact, to Gacy. So we don't know if he was linked in any way to this man as such, but he certainly did copy this man. Absolutely, he copied this man. But also that it said that this Dean, this Candyman, was also linked to this Norman, this paedophile of all paedophiles, the one that was, running this, sex ring and everything, and also getting children for other paedophiles to murder. And they say that this Candyman was one of them sort of people that use this facility, if you want to say, of Normans to also get kids to kill. So it's linked through that. Now, how Norman and Gacy are linked is by some ads that were put in the paper that that's how they used to, sort of advertise what they did, Strange, really, when you think about it now. I mean, if these people were living today and had the internet and the stuff, the technology we had today, oh my God, these people would be so dangerous when you think about it, of how bad they was in them days to how bad they could be now. And believe it, this still goes on. So when we look at all these people, and we look at the paedophile rings, we look at the sex trafficking rings, we look at the murder rings, really, because a lot of these children were abducted and sold to different paedophiles and killers to be tortured and killed. So I believe is true. So this is what links all three of these people together. These in their own right are deadly people alone. But when you put these sort of people together, it makes them, I think, some of the worst crimes in history, really. And I think when we look at Gacy and what he did and his people he had working for him, and one of them had close links to Norman, there is no doubt that link is true. There's no doubt. It's unfortunate, I think, that someone like Gacy was executed so early, because I think if people had listened to what he was trying to say throughout the time that he was waiting on death row, a lot of these people would have been arrested a lot sooner, and a lot of this would have been able to be put together where we're not theorising, that we would actually really know what happened. So I think with Gacy, yes, he did have other kills, many, many more. I don't think he worked alone on all the kills, and I've said that in my first video. I don't believe he did. I do believe he had other dump sites without a doubt, and I do believe he was in this paedophile ring, and many people even today are in paedophile rings and sex trafficking rings. They always will be. They sort of, gather together. It's sort of like they know, there must be something about them that, they know. But this was also done by advertising in a newspaper, certain ads that had sort of keywords in these ads that either attracted children or attracted paedophiles to them. I mean, this man was bad, Gacy, but Norman, I think, was probably even worse. So, John David Norman began his criminal career in Houston, where he was arrested in 1954 and 1956 for child molestation. His next arrest was in California in 1963 and for sexual assault, and I think that began in 1969 for distribution of obscene materials, and he was sentenced then to 16 months in prison for that. By 1973, this is the time now of Gacy and the Candyman sort of was going around. Norman was running a child prostitution ring called the Odyssey Foundation. This was covered in the United States, major Canadian cities, parts of Europe. Norman used to mail forwarding addresses based in San Diego to reach out to his customers through a base of operations that was located in Dallas. So here's the other states coming in. We've got Chicago, Dallas, and other states now coming in. Norman did not really rely on ads alone. He had searched for potential victims in bus stations, arcades. His victims were usually runaways, very similar to Gacy, very similar, and actually also to the Candyman. So in August 1973, Norman brought 21-year-old male prostitute called Charles Benzine to Dallas for one of his clients. Now, while in Norman's apartment, this Charles found photos of boys with the word kill written on them. So due to these reports of this, mass murderer or murder in Houston, Charles, this young lad, this 21-year-old, became terrified as he has responded actually to Norman's ad to call the FBI, and that's what he did. So this is how things come out. So then the FBI contacted Dallas police, who on August the 14th raided Norman's business, to which they found index cards. Around 5 to 10% of those were names of and physical descriptions of the boys in Norman's network, aged between 13 and 19. The remainder were clients. His filing system separated the clients into 3 categories using colour-coded system, using a set of colours, sort of like indicating really individuals received pamphlets through the mail. So blue would indicate that the individuals had contacted Norman by phone, expressing their interest in meeting boys. Green indicated the individual was running a child stable, generally, in an apartment building or somewhere like that. So they had their own sort of run. So this is where he would use them contacts of the green to get other boys in. So, I mean, they found all this stuff, right? They found all these colour cards, and we sort of, these greens and these blues, and indicated, didn't they, what these people want. Some already had children to sell and get rid of and use. They were all already their own paedophile rings, and the blues, were paedophiles or sexual offenders that would contact him. So after this boy went to the FBI and stuff, this man was then put out, wasn't he, on bail. Of course, he's gone. He ain't going to stay around, is he, this bloke? So he's changed his name to this Steve Gunwell, and he flees then to Illinois. And of course he knows a lot of people because he's got a lot of clients. If we look at his 50,000 index cards that he had on different paedophiles and also on kids that he had used and sold to these people, he was harboured then really by, accomplices and people like that. So I think when he was in Illinois, he started to, he had this apartment where he was hiding out, but he couldn't help himself. And he had lured about 10 young lads back to this apartment. And I think he abused them, he sexually assaulted them, or as many as he could actually, he sexually assaulted. And he was charged at that point because they of course reported it, and then he was charged with 6 counts of taking indecent liberties with a child, with things to minors really, and deviant sexual assault. He was a vicious man, this. These boys aged between 13 and 14. That's the sort of age he liked, but this man was so awful, really, really awful. Now, the police also found in this apartment that he was being, looked after in, protected, hidden by these people, another 2,000 index cards. So don't forget, they found 50,000 index cards in the first property when he was then charged and released out on bail. And as he's then done a runner, they've now, in this time that he's been on this run, he's also made now another 2,000 index cards. Really, it's just really terrible, isn't it? So I think once then he was actually locked up in Cook County Jail. Norman began a new sex trafficking ring called the Delta Project. He established a newsletter to advertise his services and appealed for donations for his bail. So now we're talking about, haven't we? We've got this man, a paedophile, a killer, really, who is using and abusing children, selling children all over the country, really, including Europe and Canada and everywhere else, all different states of America. He's got all these people. He now wants money to help him get his bail money to get him out, and of course they come up with it. So he spent 16 hours a day writing to clients. The scheme he had coordinated was a string of child stables. Pimps could house 2 to 4 boys inside each house, and that was signed really onto his network. So you would join his network. You would say, okay, I'm going to have between 2 and 4 boys in my property, what they call these stables for these kids, which would have been treated terrible, and then them children would be abused or resold or murdered from these properties. How bloody shocking, really, when you think about it. I mean, we have some cases, don't we, and I've wrote about them already, where we have them that they've made their paedophile manuals and all this sort of stuff. But when we look at the depravity of this man, and Gacy was involved in this sort of stuff as well, it's really, really shocking, isn't it? So the boys were referred to as candidates and the houses as Delta dorms. Very organised. So when we talk about crimes against children and offences against children now, in today, in 2022, but we look at the detail that these paedophiles went into in the 70s, it just makes you think, how bad is it really now? It's not changed. All it's changed is the technology, really. So how easy was it in them days to set these things up through leaflets and ads and stuff, and get these people not only to pay you, but to, house these kids and God knows what else? What really is the state of offences against children now when we look at the dark web? This is what you're dealing with now, I think, but on a bigger scale. It's really, really worrying, isn't it, really, when you look back, and this was the 70s, shocking, really. So Bailey's bail was paid from one of his clients and became affiliated with the man behind the Boys Love magazine, named Herms. But Norman, eventually convicted of child molestation, child charges from Homewood, Illinois, and sentenced to 4 years and 4 months. 4 years and 4 months. It's just, this is America, and I usually, happy with American sentences. This is what we would expect in the UK, these sort of sentences for these people. But we're talking about the 70s, aren't we, where they really didn't investigate, I think, the full impact of what was really going on here. So in June 1978, Norman was arrested again, and once again police seized thousands of index cards containing personal information on clients through pink index cards. Now, this is where this Philip Pask comes into it. Now, he was arrested while he was in Norman's Chicago apartment for photographing and molesting 2 minors. Now, this was the person, this Philip, that worked for John Wayne Gacy. So this is now what links these people, this group, to him as well, because he was also Gacy's right-hand man. And this is also one of the people that Gacy said had also committed murders. That's what was alleged to have been said. And also I think this is what a lot of these investigators have thought about this, with this man. So Norman renamed the Delta Project then the Creative Core. Gosh, this man. And then the mailer was named the Male Cell. So he was in the process of pimping out 2 boys to a man in Canada when police raided his apartment. So in 1973 in Texas, he forwarded 50,000 index cards they seized from Norman in Dallas, and that is the State Department of Washington, D.C. After Norman's latest arrest in Illinois, detective in Chicago called the State Department in order to review these cards so they could compare the evidence to the investigation of Norman's clients. Much to their surprise, though, the detectives were told that the State Department no longer had these index cards. News reporters from Chicago Tribune called the State Department to ask what happened to this evidence. They were told that all 50,000 index cards had been shredded because the State Department could not find any evidence. Now, bit of a cover-up, I think, really, when you look at it, isn't it? Really? So all these index cards with all these clients' name, details, but not only that, 50,000 cards, many of which, thousands of which, would have been index cards describing the victims and where they had gone, who they had gone to, all of a sudden has disappeared. So this is why Gacy found it difficult to prove that he was linked, or this man was linked, or this person, this Philip Pask, was linked to these murders, because evidence had been destroyed that could have opened this case up to what it really was. And this case was really, when you think, it was an absolutely massive paedophile ring that I don't think America has ever seen, really. And so it just, you have to think, why would they shred 50,000 cards? Why would they, with all this important information on it? It was colour-coded, it was easily read, there was descriptions. Some of the cards had kill wrote across the victim's name. So they had the names of these unknown victims. They had them, and they were destroyed. It's shocking, really, isn't it? Anyway, Norman was released from prison in 1982, and in February he was arrested then in Denver for soliciting a child for sex. Fleeing Colorado, Norman ended up in rural Pennsylvania under the alias of Clarence Eugene Jr. Norman set up a shop in a rural motel. This man just doesn't stop, does he? But I think when you think of everything this man's done, and then, he's out in 1982, he's still going. There are still many, many children now being affected by this. Gacy at that time is caught, No one's really listening to him. He was put to death quite quickly. He was only on death row for about 10 years. You know, he was 10 or 15 years, something like that. Not long, really, when you think about it. But this man and these others were still free to go about their business. So let's look at this John Wayne Gacy, this American serial killer. You know, now he killed from January 1972 to December 1978. He raped and tortured 33 young men, teenagers and boys in Chicago, Illinois. And he was executed by lethal injection on the 10th of December 1994. So that's basically it, isn't it, with John Wayne Gacy? Everyone thought he's gone, that's it, it's finished. So it was widely speculated that Gacy had accomplices due to being out of the state on several of his victims went missing, and the surviving victims of Jeffrey Rignall being that there was someone else in the house at the time that he was being tortured. So we know now by Jeffrey's sort of, you know, the only surviving victim, or one we know of, really, because a lot of kids in them days didn't come forward, even if they did. So he was being tortured, but he did say that there was someone else in that property at the time of him being tortured. Now, Gacy ran a construction company called this PDM, and people speculated that his employer, Michael Rossi, and David Cram were also his accomplices, and this Philip Pask, who helped John Norman run this Delta Project sex trafficking ring, was one of Gacy's employees, being brought in by David Cram. But they were all acquaintances, weren't they? I think it's led to the theories that Gacy and Norman were working together, and this is where this whole theory comes from. But I think when you actually look at the victimology here and what else happened, and you know, there's lots of times when Gacy wasn't in the state that other kids went missing. I think there is a clear link here. I really do. So when Gacy was pleading his innocence for in interview, he named Norman Pask, Rossi and Cram as the ones responsible for the deaths of the men and teenage boys. I don't believe that. I don't believe that he didn't do that. I don't know if the others helped him do it, but he certainly wasn't innocent then. So when Gacy pleaded his innocence in this interview, he named Norman Pask, Rossi and Cram as the ones responsible for the deaths of these men. Now, you know, Gacy was a killer, right? He was. But there are theories that he says that he didn't know Norman, right? He also says, or Norman, this terrible man, and he said, I've yet to see a current photo of him. So it's difficult, isn't it, to believe, because as I said, serial killers are serial liars as well. But I do believe there's something in this, but I think there's a lot of theories that Gacy was also meant to be set up and take the blame for all these crimes, which frees these people. And when you look at the outcome of Gacy's case, and you look at the outcome and the destroying of 50,000 index cards of evidence of Norman and his paedophile ring and stuff like that, that's exactly what happened, isn't it? Really, when you think about it. So I'm not saying Gacy wasn't a killer. I'm saying that Gacy was a killer with others, but whether he knew Norman or not, they made sure that he took the blame. This is what people are trying, the theories that people are trying to say. So these are the sort of people that were still out doing their business after Gacy was incarcerated and then eventually was executed. So there's a lot more to Gacy's case. There's a lot more to the unknown victims. There's a lot more to the accomplices that he may or may not have had. There's a lot more to, all the killers named in this, really. When you think about it, when you think about these killers, Dean Corll and this serial killer that was around from 1970 to 1973, He was known to sort of use these sort of sites to get these boys. His killing spree of 28 boys of what we know of. Then we have Norman, who really, when you think about, is probably the worst of the worst, because there was no limits to what this man would do to these children, and no limits to what he would do to make money and to help other paedophiles and other sex rings, or stables, or they want to call them, because that's what they think these kids are, as animals. They don't treat them like children, because they're there for one thing only, to be used and abused and then either murdered or sold on until they're not old enough, or they're there to be groomed to make the next load come up so they can get more children. This is how it sort of works when we talk about paedophile rings. And it's really shocking, isn't it, when you think, how long Gacy tried to say stuff to different investigators and stuff, but it wasn't believed. He wasn't believed. I mean, really, when you think about this could have been one of the biggest cracked cases in the world if they had actually really looked into this, not destroyed evidence and everything else. They could have took down a lot of people here. Thousands of people here. But they didn't. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Why didn't they? Why didn't they think that, Norman and Gacy and all these other suspects within this case, were worthy of a massive investigation that would have saved loads of children's lives? Listen, in addition to the teenagers being believed to have been killed by Gacy, were Kenneth Parker, Michael Mario. They were last seen alive close to where Norman lived. And they also, at that time, Gacy was also seen to be near that area of Norman's apartment. So, as I said, Gacy was a serial killer, but Gacy was also a serial liar. So you can't believe everything. But I don't know if at first Gacy thought he wouldn't say anything, but then as time went on, and he couldn't do what he wanted to do anymore, he was incarcerated, he started then to say things about these others and say, hang on, it wasn't just me, it was others. And these others, when you look at them, really are actually far worse than Gacy, because they killed thousands. When you really look at it, and you look at these index cards, we're talking about kids going missing in their thousands, and most of these kids will never ever be found. So we're not just talking about Chicago crime or Dallas crimes, or we're talking about America states, throughout Canada's cities and states. We're also talking about Europe these people had reached to. You can't do that unless you have a network of people that allow you to do that. But then to lose that evidence, to have that evidence destroyed, to where there is no way back now to putting these cards together. They weren't that good in them days, these criminals, that they could, it's not like we're now having to get through internet codes and stuff like that, decoding stuff. These were just very simple, colour-coded index cards, handwritten. It would have been easy to really find out what happened to these children and also other perpetrators within this crime. So this is shocking, isn't it, really, when we look at this, Gacy's case, but more in depth into Gacy's case. What it opens up, what it makes you think about what was really going on then, and probably potentially what is going on now, just on a whole different level. It really opens up your mind to just how depraved these people are, and how they would take our children off the streets, use them, sell them, murder them for just their own sexual gratification. These people are evil people. What else can you say about these people apart from they are absolutely evil? But as I said, all serial killers are known to lie. All serial killers are manipulative people. And most serial killers, and especially when we look at serial killers that go for children, have escalated from molesting and, raping and all this sort of stuff into serial killers. But they all sort of know each other within this sort of crime. There's links there to all these people because the victims were all Gacy's type. The victims of the Candyman were all the same sort of victims as Gacy, and the victims of Norman were around the same age and type as well. They all took these children off the streets, all classed sort of as runaways, people that wouldn't be missed. Victimology, when you look at crime, the victims tell us a lot. But when we have the police and stuff in them days, services getting rid of evidence like that so it can never be looked at again, we have to ask ourselves why they would do that, why they would do that anyway, to destroy any evidence that could have potentially have saved lives and put many people in prison. So anyway, this was the second part of the Gacy case, just a bit of more in-depth information, I suppose. Not so much about his crimes, but about his links to other crimes and other potential, people that worked with him, his connections to that, and other people that may have killed these kids. But when you have a survivor of John Wayne Gacy telling you that there was someone else in that house, and also don't forget that John Wayne Gacy used chloroform, he liked to knock them out. What happened to these kids? We'll never really know, will we? We'll never really know. But this boy was lucky to survive. But yeah, I do believe him when he says there was someone else in that home. I think this is quite a sad case, this really, when we think about that we'll never ever learn the truth. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on Let's Have a Chat About Murder. I love podcasting. I think it's so much easier. I can sit here, drink my coffee, have a chat, go over a few crimes. So you're still going to get your 2 uploads a week, what I upload onto Murder Analysed, but there's going to be a lot more cases also put specifically just for you on Let's Have a Chat About Murder. So thanks for listening, and until the next time, bye-bye.